Hi there. During lockdown, I've been reading a few different things, but at the moment I'm reading some of Clive James' memoirs. So this is a collection of three different autobiographies that he published. Together it's called Always Unreliable. So I'm going to read a bit today from the first of the three, which is called Unreliable Memoirs. So I'll just read you a little bit from the back first of all. It's described as three of the sharpest, most brilliant and outrageously funny memoirs you will ever read. In Unreliable Memoirs, we meet a very young Clive James, one dressed in shorts. His hilarious adventures growing up in post-war Sydney are deliciously recounted in this, the first volume of his memoirs. And there's a quote on the back from the Sunday Times newspaper saying, "Do not read this book in public. You will risk severe internal injuries from trying to suppress your laughter. What's worse, you can't put it down once started. Not to be missed." And I would agree with that. It's one of the funniest things I've ever read. So you might not have heard of Clive James. He died earlier this year, sadly. Very famous writer and broadcaster. He had some really popular TV shows when I was about your age. He was a poet as well. Just a very funny man. So I'm going to read a little bit from one of the chapters, probably towards the end of Unreliable Memoirs, when he's doing his national service. So it's a chapter called Basic Training. National service was universally known in Australia as NASHO. Once you were in it, 4 years went by before you were out of it. There was a 3-week camp every year, plus numerous parades. But the most brutal fact about NASHO was the initial 77-day period of basic training, most of which took place at Ingleburn. Each new intake of gormless youth was delivered into the hands of regular army instructors who knew everything about licking unpromising material into shape. When we stepped off the bus at Ingleburn, they were already screaming at us. Screaming sergeants and corporals appeared suddenly out of huts. I stood clutching my suitcase and wondered what had gone wrong with my life. While I goggled at a screaming sergeant, I was abruptly blown sideways by a bellow originating from somewhere behind my right ear. Recovering, I turned to face Ronnie the One. His real name was Warrant Officer First Class Ronald MacDonald, but he was known throughout the army as Ronnie the One. Responsible for battalion discipline, he had powers of life and death over all non-commissioned personnel, and could even bring charges against officers up to the rank of captain. His appearance was almost inconceivably unpleasant. A pig born looking like him would have demanded plastic surgery. His brass gleamed like gold and his leather like mahogany, but the effect was undone by his khaki drills, which, despite being ironed glass smooth, were perpetually soaked with sweat. Ronnie the One dripped sweat even on a cold day. It was not just because he was fat, although he had a behind like an old sofa. It was because he was always screaming so hard. At that moment he was screaming directly at me. "Get a haircut!" Later on, a translator told me that this meant "get your hair cut," and could generally be taken as a friendly greeting, especially if you could still see his eyes. When Ronnie was really annoyed, his face swelled up and turned purple like the rear end of an amorous baboon. Something about my general appearance annoyed Ronnie. There were 1,000 trainees in the intake, but I was among the select handful of those whose aspect he just couldn't abide. I could be standing in a queue, Ronnie would be a dot in the distance, and suddenly his voice would arrive like incoming artillery. "Get a bigger hat!" He meant that I should get a bigger hat. He didn't like the way it sat on top of my head. Perhaps he just didn't like my head and wanted the whole thing covered up. The drill that I had learned in Boys' Brigade saved my life. When it came to square bashing, it turned out that the years I'd spent interpreting Captain Andrews' commands had given me a useful insight into what Ronnie was likely to mean by his shouts and screamed. When Ronnie yelled, "A bigger!" I knew almost straight away that it must mean "about turn." Thus I was able to turn decisively with the many instead of dithering with the few. On the parade ground, Peebles drew most of the lightning. He was so uncoordinated that he should not have been passed medically fit, but since he had been, the army was stuck with him. After a month of training, when Ronnie shouted, "A bigger!" 999 soldiers would smartly present their backs and Peebles would be writhing on the ground, strangled by the sling of his rifle. For Peebles, the day of reckoning came when he obeyed an order to fix bayonets. This was one of Ronnie's most frightening orders. It had the verb at the end, as in German or Latin. In English, the order would have sounded something like, "Bayonets, fix!" Bellowed by Ronnie, it came out as, "Bayonet!" The last word was delivered as a high-pitched, almost supersonic scream. It was succeeded on this occasion by another scream, since Peebles' bayonet, instead of appearing at the end of his rifle, was to be seen protruding from the back of the soldier standing in front of him. After that, they used to mark Peebles present at company parade every morning, but lose him behind a tree on the way to battalion parade, where he was marked absent. My kit, not my drill, was what got me into trouble. For once in my life I had to make my own bed every morning, without fail, and lay out for inspection my neatly polished and folded belongings. Since the penalty for not doing this properly was to have the whole lot thrown on the floor and be obliged to start again, I gradually got better at it, but I never became brilliant. The problem became acute when it was my platoon's turn to mount guard. Throughout the entire 24 hours it was on duty, the guard was inspected, supervised, harassed and haunted by Ronnie the One. The initial inspection of kit, dress and rifle lasted a full hour. Ronnie snorted at my brass, retched at my webbing, and turned puce when he looked down the barrel of my rifle. "This is not a guard rifle!" he yelled. He meant that it was not a guard rifle. "It's full of potatoes!" He meant that it was full of potatoes? I looked down the barrel, and now I saw that a single speck of grit had crept into it. In the guardhouse we had to scrub the floors and tables, whitewash the walls and polish the undersides of the drawing pins on the notice board. When we went out on picket we could not afford to relax for a moment, since Ronnie could be somewhere in the vicinity preparing to do his famous banzai charge. At 2 o'clock in the morning I was guarding the transport park. It was raining. Sitting down in the sentry box, I had the brim of my hat unbuttoned and was hanging from the collar of my ground sheet, praying for death. I had my rifle inside my ground sheet with me so that I could fold my hands on its muzzle, lean my chin on the cushion formed by my hands under the cape, and gently nod off while still looking reasonably alert. I had calculated that Ronnie would not come out in the rain. This proved to be a bad guess. I thought the sentry box had been struck by lightning, but it was merely Ronnie's face going off like a purple grenade about a foot in front of mine. I came to attention as if electrocuted and tried to shoulder arms. Since the rifle was still inside my ground sheet, merely to attempt this manoeuvre was bound to yield Peeble-like results. Ronnie informed me, in a tirade which sounded and felt like an atomic attack, that he had never seen anything like in his life. The inevitable consequence was extra kitchen duty.